Um, Good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Monk. I'm a professor of law at Birkbeck in the School of Law at University of London, and I've been working there for about, over 20 years now. One of the things I enjoy about my job is having these legal practice conversations, and they're an opportunity for me as a legal academic to talk to someone who works in law in practice, actually advises real people and is involved with day-to-day actions and doings of law. And this has been running for quite a time, these legal practice conversations. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our guest this evening, who is Josh Asokan, who is an accredited senior caseworker in immigration law and who works at Turpin Miller Solicitors. What's going to happen this evening is that Josh and I are going to have a conversation, a wide-ranging conversation, and then at the end, there'll be an opportunity for all of you to put your cameras on and ask questions. And you can always, ask questions in the chat as well, and we'll come back to that as the meeting goes on. So, welcome, Josh. Welcome virtually to Birkbeck University of London School of Law. It's great to have you with us this evening.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Josh, so good evening, Josh. Welcome to Birkbeck University of London. It's great to have you with us. I'm delighted to welcome you to this legal practice conversation event. I'd like to start by asking you just an opening question about how did you find your way to the legal profession? How did you end up working in law?
It's not a straightforward answer for me because I didn't go down the traditional route of finishing school and then going to university, studying law, and then going straight into the profession. I'm a musician by training, so studied music at university, and then went on to do further study in music as an orchestral conductor and concert pianist. And it was while I was doing my master's in music that I came across a drop-in center for refugees in Cardiff, where I was based. And this was a place where refugees could come in to collect their weekly shopping in the form of donations from a food bank, and they could sit down and talk with volunteers in the center. So I gave some of my time towards that initiative, and the conversations I had were really compelling and it intrigued me. I had no awareness or interest whatsoever in asylum law before this experience. I was completely oblivious to it. I'd heard about it in the news, but really not engaged with it in any meaningful way. But it was only when I met these people, these individuals, and start these conversations. They came from a number of different countries from around the world. And I was learning about geopolitical situations around the world, but also personal experiences, the torture and the violence and horrific things that have happened to these people, which have led to them leaving their countries and fleeing for safety. So those conversations are what then led me to decide I wanted to work with asylum seekers in some capacity. The two options for me at the time were either going into charitable work in for a charity or going and working in a law firm because I wanted direct contact with asylum seekers. And I chose the latter, so working in a law firm. And we can talk about qualification pathways in a bit more detail later, but I'm what we call a senior caseworker. And to get to that stage, I've had to do some professional exams, but I started off working as a paralegal at this law firm in Oxford, and then over 1.5 years, I qualified as a senior caseworker, and I now manage a caseload of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children.
That's great. Thank you. There's lots of the things I want to go back to unpack there. Okay. Great. So it's really interesting, your route to law there, Josh. That's great. in particular that you wanted to work directly with asylum seekers and to actually talk to them. I think many of us know about the issue. Immigration is something that's sort of on the news in all sorts of different formats and different ways, but very few of us actually have that first-hand ability to actually talk to people, and actually to hear their stories directly. And that's something that's you mentioned, and we're going to talk a lot about what it means to be working in the field of asylum law at the moment. But first of all, I just want to pick up on what you said about being a legal profession, because I think when people think about being a lawyer, they either think of being a solicitor or a barrister. Indeed, when many people thinking about being lawyers, they just think of people in wigs in court. And obviously, what's happened in the way the profession has developed is that the vast majority of people giving legal advice and the number of people who actually work in law and with law actually aren't necessarily solicitors or barristers. And your professional job description title is a accredited senior caseworker. Now, I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that status and when it was set up, how you actually get to be a caseworker, because it's a route to being someone who advises people, to all intents and purposes, is actually representing someone and being someone's lawyer, but isn't actually a solicitor or a barrister. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what that actually means being an accredited caseworker. And just before that, it's interesting you said you started work as a paralegal. And lots of students at Birkbeck work as paralegals and study law in the evenings. And I think being a paralegal is a great way both to have a great profession in the law and indeed a route into developing further as a lawyer. So what did you do when you were a paralegal? And then how did you become a caseworker? What actually is that status? And how did the job differ from becoming a paralegal to being a caseworker? Are there things that you're allowed to do or not allowed to do with that status that you've got? So lots of questions for you about your actual job description title.
So I'm going to take a step back slightly and explain why this status exists in the first place. Across the UK, there's a massive issue where we're seeing lots of people who want to access a legal representative, who want a lawyer, who are not able to do so. So we call the issue in the industry legal aid deserts. So legal aid is where people are not able to pay for their own legal representation, and the state funds their representation. So there are lots of people across the UK who are in that position, who are not able to pay for a lawyer, but need one. And the state has certain obligations to provide that service. But the number of firms who are actually providing that service across the UK is very few. And since 2012, that number has drastically gone down due to cuts to legal aid state funding available for this. So as a result, the Law Society of England and Wales, in collaboration with the SRA, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, that's the body that regulates all solicitors in the UK, have set up this scheme to encourage more young legal professionals and lawyers to go into legal aid work without necessarily having legal qualification as a solicitor or a barrister, but being a specialist in a very particular field. When I speak to lay people, I explain this to them somewhat like being a doctor and a dentist. The qualification route for a dentist is slightly shorter and much more specialized, whereas a doctor is focused on the whole of the human body as a GP. So in my case, what it means as a senior caseworker for me is that I'm only able to practice immigration and asylum law, and I my scope is restricted in that sense. But within immigration and asylum law, I've got full conduct over all of my cases and all of the people I represent. So I'm not supervised necessarily by a line manager, except one of the partners at the firm. So I report directly to the partners, and I have my own cases which I handle and manage. So in practice, in our firm, Turpin and Miller, between those who have qualified as solicitors and those working as senior caseworkers, there is no difference whatsoever in the work we do. We even have, as senior caseworkers, the ability to represent our clients in court. So do what we normally instruct barristers to do, but in practice, we don't really do that because we act in our clients' best interests, and we think a barrister who's got years of experience specializing in advocacy in court is best placed to do that. So not even a solicitor would actually go and speak in court. We handle the paperwork side of things, and barristers step in to do that job. But to sort of backtrack to your question about paralegals, um, so there are things that you're allowed and not allowed to do. So immigration law and asylum law in particular in the UK is one of the few areas of law where to give legal advice without two particular qualifications is a criminal offense and is punishable. So if you have a random person out there claiming to give or wanting to give immigration advice, and they're not regulated by either the Law Society or what we call the OISC, the Office of the Immigration Services Commissioner, they are not eligible to give legal advice, and doing so is a crime. And we can talk about this later, but we've actually represented foreign nationals who have got into a mess by actually trying to give immigration advice and are now facing deportation on account of criminal charges. So the work is restricted, and it's based on three different tiers. So you start as a casework assistant, where you only assist a senior caseworker. So that's what the paralegals do initially to begin. And we are not allowed to do any work related to children because that's a restricted area of work. So you work on adult asylum cases, you can do a bit of work on deportation claims, and that work is not always client facing. It's a lot of form filling, and there's a lot of form filling with the Home Office when you're dealing with them. And then you progress on to casework assistant, which is the next level above, where you do a bit more legal drafting. And then as a senior caseworker, you've got full conduct of your cases and you deal with clients. So what I'm going to do is drop two links in the chat. The first is a map of the UK, which shows legal aid deserts. So the areas in the UK where we don't have legal representation, and you can have a look at that. And the second link is with the Law Society's accreditation scheme. So for anyone wanting to practice as an immigration lawyer, this is the scheme you have to go through and qualify with if you're working for a firm that's regulated by the SRA. Sorry, that was a long answer, but
No, that's great. Thanks, Josh. It is fascinating. And obviously that whole concept of there being, a legal advice desert has sort of been in many ways created by the absolute decimation of legal aid. In some areas of law, it's simply not available at all. But even in areas where formally it is available, and as you said, there are areas where people are entitled to be to have advice, it's simply not become feasible for law firms to function doing sort of work on that basis. And I suppose the other thing that's really interesting is this idea of almost a monopoly, this idea that you can't give this advice. It's a crime to give advice, to act as a lawyer in a certain area or to act in that role. It's a fascinating idea that that's actually criminalized. As a separate conversation, that's really interesting. I didn't realize it actually being criminal. I knew it was sort of professional ethics and there were restrictions. For example, I know there's a current big debate about should only lawyers be able to write wills? What happens? On one hand, it's protecting consumers, protecting people, because anyone can sort of advertise, I can give advice about this on the internet, and you've got no idea of the quality advice, and you've got no way back to challenge them if the advice they've given is very bad. Whereas if someone's professional, member of a professional body, accredited, whether it's as a caseworker or indeed as a lawyer, as a solicitor, they operate within a professional framework which offers some kind of protection to people. So it's a really interesting idea that about the limits to advice to people at the moment around law, and the importance of it, and who should be able to do it. I did also notice that the Ministry of Justice is at the moment offering funding for people who want to go down the accredited caseworker route. I saw something on the Law Society website where they're so encouraging people to go down this route. They'll pay for people's applications. So I think the Law Society and the Ministry of Justice are working together on trying to incentivize more people to go down this route to fulfill that need. So I want to ask you a little bit about your actual job in terms of what it means. We've spoken a bit of the technicalities there. What's your day-to-day job like? I mean, is there a day-to-day typical day for you in the office? It might not actually be in the office. So where is it? Where does it take place? What's your typical or 8 day's work like?
It varies, but there are typical things I do in a week. So I work with children. So all of my clients are under the age of 18, and most of them will be between the ages of 13 and 18, broadly speaking. They are referred to us by the local authority, so the local council, in this case, Oxfordshire County Council. And each of these children, when they arrive in the UK, are completely separated from any relatives. So they're arriving in the UK alone. And so they're allocated a social worker who acts as their legal guardian. And the social worker then brings the child into our offices to meet with us and to get legal representation. So from that point onwards, it's my responsibility to take care of this child's case all the way to the point of them being either granted or refused asylum.
And can I just check, is that when they're unaccompanied? If it was children who were with their parents or with family or with adult carers, would they come to you or not? Or is your focus how broad is it? Is it all children or particular children?
So if they were accompanied by their parents, their claim would fall under their parents' asylum claims. So they would be classed as dependents under their parents' claims. But here, the only person here is the child. So the child would have to have their own case, and that's why we represent them individually.
Right. Okay, that's really interesting. Josh, asking about children, as a child law, my sense is it's one of the things we talk about in child law is a child. How do we know what a child is? Because in some ways it could be quite complicated. And I understand that sometimes they may not have records. Oh, how do you prove? So is there any question about, who is a child? What is a child? How does that arise in practice?
This is a really interesting area because we face a common issue with age disputes. So a lot of these children come from cultures where literacy, numeracy is not a thing. So many of them don't really know how old they are because they've never been to school. Some of them don't even know how to count because their cultures don't really keep a sense of date, time, the calendar as we know it in the Western world. And for them, as soon as they arrive in the UK, one of the questions they're asked is, "What's your name? How old are you?" And for a child to be asked that question and to not have an answer is really difficult. So then the Home Office officials have to make a judgment as to whether this person presenting as an unaccompanied child is or is not a child. Now, they do that on the spot with a number of criteria they have based on physical appearance, based on maturity during their initial conversation. and a number of other factors, which are very often completely arbitrary. And a lot of mistakes are made by home office caseworkers in placing kids at particular ages. A lot of children are assessed to be over 18. But then when they're actually placed under the care of a social services local authority, the social worker and the local authority have a responsibility to conduct what we call a Merton compliant age assessment, which is done by, it's a very comprehensive process. You've got around 5 people in the room with the child. So you've got a medical professional, a mental health professional, you've got the 2 social workers and a representative from the home office. So 5 people in the room with the child, speaking to the child in quite a child sensitive, child friendly manner, trying to assess whether this person is 18 or under. And then if they're over 18, their cases are made as adult asylum claims, which have got a very slight difference in processing. And then if they're under 18, they're treated as such.
Right. So what is in law the difference in entitlements or rights between an unaccompanied minor and an adult asylum seeker? To what extent does the law distinguish in terms of entitlement between those two categories? So you said that sometimes arbitrarily and perhaps by mistake, someone who is perhaps 17 or 16 might actually be treated as a 19-year-old or over 18. So what implications would there be?
So Section 55 of the Borders, Citizenship and Immigration Act of 2009 imposes on the Secretary of State a duty to safeguard the welfare of children. So that is in law, it's enshrined in law. Now, that can sound quite vague, and it is, I think, quite intentionally vague in terms of what that looks like in practice, because they want to keep the scope broad enough to cover a number of different issues. So mental health vulnerabilities, dealing with victims of trafficking, issues with sort of interviewing children, sensitivity to memory issues that children might have. And so all of these things can't necessarily be put in writing. So this is one provision legally that's in law that places this burden and responsibility on the Home Secretary to act in the best interests of children. So that is far-reaching, but on a more practical level, for children, it means that their asylum interviews have to be conducted in a child-sensitive way. Sorry, I'm hearing a bit of echo.
Yes.
I think, yeah, it's fine now.
Okay.
So their asylum interviews have to be conducted in a child-sensitive way. And if they're refused asylum before the age of 17 and a half, they are granted what we call discretionary leave. So it's a special kind of permission to stay in the UK until they turn 17 and a half to be able to complete their education in this country. So that's a special provision that exists in law, that if a child is refused asylum, they're able to stay in the country until they turn 17 and a half, and then a decision is made as to their future.
Right. Okay. So the process, it's a lot of what you're saying is about procedure in terms of the process is different. That's obviously a very clear entitlement, but in terms of the change of the onus changing, the onus being on the home office to do it changes there. I was really struck by what you said about these meetings about where there's so many professionals involved in trying to discover what is a child. I mean, that really is a fascinating question. It's really fascinating. That must be fascinating. And are you involved in that process at all?
No, we're not.
No.
And that's a really interesting thing, because there's no legal professional there to advocate for the child in these meetings under the
So if
current.
if someone is judged to not be a child, can they appeal that decision?
They can. So there can be age disputes. So where there's an age assessment made by the Home Office that a person is over 18, where there's reasonable suspicion that they're under the age of 18, we can appeal
Right.
that in a tribunal. But initially, it's an administrative appeal to the Home Office,
Right.
and they reconsider the case.
Okay.
We don't do that work because that's not always covered by legal aid, but there's funding for local authorities, so local councils to carry out
Right.
that work. So if a child is challenged, their age is challenged, you can appeal that.
Right. We focused a little bit on what it means to be a child. I'm really interested now in thinking a bit more about that concept of being unaccompanied, because that's also a kind of a legal concept, this notion of being unaccompanied. And how is that defined in practice? I mean, just because in some ways people come with other people, or could it be with another child or with a friend or somebody from their village or home? So what does unaccompanied mean in law?
In practice, what it means is that this is a child who's arriving without their parents or without an adult accompanying them. So they could arrive with a sibling who is also under the age of 18. They would still be an unaccompanied child. Each child would be treated as separate unaccompanied children. So I had an interesting case of twins who arrived together, um, and so it was that their cases were linked together because they were related and they had the same asylum claim, but in practice they didn't have parents with them and no one with parental responsibility. So they are then in the care of a social worker and treated as unaccompanied children.
I mean, are there any ever disputes about that where the Home Office will say, no, this person, they've got a 19-year-old brother, or look, they came with a cousin, or they've got, this person might not be a relative, but look, this person, they're not on their own. They've got, they came with some adults who have been looking after them and they wouldn't have been able to make it. Is this ever an area of dispute?
It's not really something I've seen before because usually there's a log of who comes into the country and that's assessed at the border. But
Mm,
there might be a case where a child coming in might have a relative who has already come to the UK and claimed asylum as an adult. They would still be considered an unaccompanied child because this is assessed at the point of arrival to the UK at the border. So even if the child has a parent in the UK, when they came to the UK, they were an unaccompanied child. Their case might later be linked to a parent. But if it's not a parent, if it's, say, an uncle or a cousin who's an adult, they would always be treated as unaccompanied children. So the key word is parent there.
right, right. Okay. Well, and as a family lawyer, that the idea of what is a parent comes to mind. That's something we spend a lot of time in family law debating. Should it be biological? Should it be a social if someone's taken on the role of a parent? But so that's really interesting. Um, uh, in a way, it's quite interesting because your area of immigration law in some ways overlaps with family law a little bit there, does it? I mean, in theory, not in theory, lots of areas of law look very separate. So you get family lawyers, you get immigration lawyers, you get property lawyers, and all these things look very neat and tidy in the law book. So you can pick up a book off the shelf that's all about immigration law, and you pick a book off the shelf about family law or child law or education law or housing law. But in practice, in real people's lives, those categories are much more complicated. So I'm sure a lot of your clients, they've got housing needs, education needs. There may be an aspect of family care, or there may be care proceeding. There may be some area law. What happens when there's an overlap with those other issues? I mean, you're accredited senior caseworker in immigration and assignment law. What happens when you think, hang on, I need to talk to a housing law or education? Does that often happen in practice where real life circumstances of your clients simply go beyond simple immigration and asylum law?
Yes, is the short answer. So a lot of the issues with unaccompanied children happen to be around accommodation and provision of accommodation, particularly after they turn 18. What
Yeah.
happens to them? And I should just say, to avoid any confusion later on in the discussion, unaccompanied children are unaccompanied children even after they turn 18 for legal purposes.
Right.
So their claims are treated as unaccompanied children even after they turn 18. So this is assessed at the point of entry to the UK. So even if you arrived at 17 years, 11 months, you're still an unaccompanied child for the rest of your asylum process, and you're supposed to be treated that way. So yes, there are issues with accommodation, issues with housing, but in practice, because of the legal aid issues I've mentioned so far, um, we're not able to provide comprehensive coverage, and there are very, very few law firms across the UK that are able to address in a holistic way all of the needs of a child. So education, for example, or accommodation. We are fortunate at Turpin Miller in that we happen to have a very small housing law department as well. But there's very limited capacity there. So if a child has issues with housing, we pass it down to the housing team in our firm. But if they've got educational issues, then we're not even able to necessarily make a referral without verifying the credibility of another law firm. So it's very often up to the social worker to make those connections between the different lawyers.
And then if it's just to the social worker and the local authority, then there isn't that independent somebody that is the good thing about law is that role of, being able to challenge perhaps the decisions a social worker makes. I know someone did a wonderful piece of research about the education of homeless children, not about immigration. And the key thing for the education rights of homeless children is that they were just kept them falling down the middle of education law and housing law. It was really hard because things have become so specialized in the legal profession, partly because of financial reasons, but partly because of the regulation system. A firm has to have a particular type of regulated to be accredited to do work in a particular area. And that's not just in sort of the legal aid that are public law areas, it's in all areas, even if someone who just goes and buys a flat and talks to a conveyancer and then thinks, well, I might actually like to write a will now I've actually bought a flat. The people who do the conveyancing say, no, we don't do wills. You've got to go to a different law firm because we're not accredited to do that. So that problem comes up quite a lot as the impact in practice of categorizations that really don't reflect people's lives in many ways, because people's lives are much more complicated than legal categories.
I think the issue was more pronounced when we were dealing with adults, because there we had, when I was working as a paralegal, I dealt with victims of domestic violence who have got a separate immigration route for them. And they might be an asylum seeker at the same time. So then there's a family law, criminal law issue, and there's accommodation issues, then there's immigration issues. There's trafficking, which we also do at our firm, the trafficking cases and handling representations around that. But yeah, it's trickier for adults than for children.
Yeah, complicated. So I want to go back to sort of what your day-to-day, work looks like. So the local authority calls you and says, right, there's this unaccompanied minor, and they then instruct you. Okay, so if you could take it from there, what happens in an average case? So the local authority are responsible for unaccompanied minors. They contact you. What happens then? Talk me through that.
I'm going to try and share my screen because I've got a graphic which illustrates this.
Great.
Try and do that.
It's, yeah, there's the share arrow at the top of the page. Or if you can't, you can put it in the chat.
Yeah, I might do that.
All right. And then my colleague Claire might access it and be able to share it.
Yeah.
Great. So if you just put it in the chat, Josh, and then we'll take it from there. If it's something you can click there.
If it could be yeah, shared on the screen, that'll be great. Thank you.
Lovely. Over. Thanks. My colleague will deal with that. Thank you. Okay.
So this is a document prepared by the Refugee Council, which is a charity slash advocacy organization that helps asylum seekers in the UK. And the Home Office outsources some of their functions to them. But this is the asylum process that kids have to go through when they come to in the UK. So they arrive, I'm referring to the numbers now on the graphic. They arrive in the UK and they claim asylum. They say they need to be protected. They don't necessarily always know the word asylum, so they say I want to be safe, or I'm fleeing X situation in X country, and that'll usually be in Dover or Kent, and their fingerprints are taken down. They're asked a few basic questions. Now I'm on number 3, which is called a child welfare interview. The Home Office is not necessarily supposed to ask questions in any detail about their asylum claim, but very basic questions as to, in 1 or 2 sentences, why did you leave your country? The reason for that is they don't have a lawyer with them at that point. So they're just alone with the Home Office official. So it's just usually biographical details. How old are you? Where were you born? What are your parents' names, etc. And then the there's independent advice in this graphic, which doesn't normally happen. That advisors by charities, they don't really come into the picture very often. But then they're transferred to the care of a local authority, and the social worker brings them to see us. So in any meeting, which happens in our offices, I'm present, the child is present, the social worker is present, and we have an interpreter there as well, because most of these children don't speak English.
Yes, I was going to ask about translators actually in a moment.
So we work very closely with interpreters. So 4 people in the room for every single appointment. And in that first appointment, I explained to the child this diagram, basically. This is the process you're going through, and this is the stage you're at. And this is what the rest of your case could look like. I will take down basic instructions on their story. And sadly, for particular countries at the moment, say, for example, if you're from Albania or from Iran, I know the outcome they're going to get, because at the moment, the Home Office is taking a fairly controversial stance on blanket refusals for asylum claims from these countries.
Are they sort of right? Are they sort of saying, those countries are safe? Is that their approach?
For Albania, they're saying that. For Iran, they're not saying anything, but they're refusing all asylum claims at the moment, is what we're seeing. So sadly, if a young person comes to me from one of those countries, I have to say to them, look, the Home Office most likely is going to refuse your claim, but we have the option of appealing that at the tribunal stage. So I'll come to that in a moment. So I explain about the process and say to the child, we've got to do quite a lot of work together to write down your story, to document your story. And I say, okay, we're going to have about 5 meetings together of 1.5 hours each. And then that's number 6, evidence collecting, where I will sit down with the child, and yeah, 4 people in the room.
How long will you spend with a child on average when you're, doing that? How much time do you get with them?
6 hours on average after the first meeting. So
is that 6 hours because that's what legal aid will cover, or is it 6 hours because that's just the amount of time it takes? Or
6 hours on average, I say. So it could be less, it could be more. Legal aid covers however long it takes for us to draft the statement. So there is no restriction on that. So I have children whom I've spent 9 hours working on their story with, kids who've just done the whole thing in 4 hours. It varies, but that's a ballpark figure. I say to them to set expectations, because some of them, they're extremely traumatized. So we're dealing here with kids who are who have faced some of them systematic abuse, torture, and they're suffering from diagnosed mental health issues like PTSD, so very vulnerable children, and for them to recall everything that's happened to them is traumatic again, right? So
Yes.
we've got to do all of this in a very child sensitive,
Yeah. I mean,
child manner.
it's interesting that you mentioned that the retelling of the story is actually quite traumatizing. I mean, I think you mentioned the word trauma there, so I just wanted to add in. I mean, in some ways it's an overused word perhaps today, trauma, but undoubtedly the people you're talking to, it's extraordinary high levels of trauma and real devastating trauma. And there is a concept that's quite clear from the academic literature actually around domestic abuse, which is that of secondary abuse, which is the abuse that takes place from the way in which the system actually deals with the initial problem, you know, and actually having to give evidence. If your body is evidence, having to tell your story again countless times, and perhaps in a way in which you're going to be judged according to all of that, can actually exacerbate aspects of the trauma. So it's a very serious issue. That, yeah.
And we've got to be incredibly alert and aware to body language, signs of voice fluctuations, very subtle things in a meeting I'm looking out for. And sometimes it might just be very overt. So I've had many children just break down in tears. And that's why the social worker is there.
Right.
A very hard thing for me, which I had to learn early on in the job, is how to manage the emotional side of this job. And we can talk about that in more detail. But in appointments, I have to be very conscious that my role as legal representative is to present their case in the best possible way for them to the Home Office. And if I take the role of comforting them emotionally or being emotionally available to them, that makes things a lot harder for me to do that in an objective way for tens and tens of clients I represent. So at the moment, I've got a caseload of around 60 to 70 children I represent. So if I were to get emotionally invested in all of those cases, that's not possible. So in those sessions, we basically write down a statement of their entire life story for as long as they can remember. And we will talk about a statement in detail as we're going to look at one. But then I send that off to the Home Office, and then they've got a substantive interview. And this can be quite a grueling experience for children. And this is another big part of my work on a day-to-day basis. So I will sit in with the child at the interview. This usually happens at our offices, and the Home Office people log in on a Teams call like this. So on our end, the child, the social worker, myself, and on their end, on the screen, we'll see a Home Office interviewer and an interpreter. And from my experience, these interviews can last anywhere between 1.5 to 5.5 hours for a child.
That's an extraordinary process for a child to go through. Extraordinary.
So after having been through all of this with me and having written down the statement over 6 or so hours, they're not supposed to be questioned on all of that again. But in practice, they are subject to that line of questioning, and it depends on what sort of Home Office interviewer you get. They can be very interrogatory, and that's where I come in as legal representative. Section 55 of the Borders Act, which I mentioned earlier, the welfare of children, comes into play in situations like this. So if I feel a Home Office worker is being interrogatory, I mean, some of them, they've treated these children like they're criminals in the tone they've adopted with questioning. So I have to say, I'm very sorry, but you've got a duty under Section 55 to safeguard the welfare of the child. If you're not going to be able to do that, I have to terminate this interview or make a complaint to your supervisor. Very often the people conducting these interviews are civil servants with no legal training whatsoever. So
I mean, do they get training in terms of how to deal with a deeply traumatized young person?
They're supposed to get training. In theory, whether that happens is very questionable. Over the last few weeks, we've seen statistics on the rate of turnover, staff turnover at the Home Office, which is alarmingly high. So the number of staff coming in and leaving on a regular basis is very unhealthy. So in practice, what we see is that most of the interviewers we deal with are not equipped to actually do this in a child-sensitive way. So it's very important that I'm there in the room to take
Yeah.
care of the child as the legal representative and to intervene. And the
I wonder,
social
yeah, I just wonder if I can ask a question about the role of the interpreter. And it's interesting you used the word interpreter. I always thought it was a translator, and it's quite an interesting word, interpreter, because it's interpreting, not translating. So I wonder if you can say a bit about that role, because I wonder, I imagine it's quite an important role in terms of perhaps having some cultural understanding, or of what silence might mean. When we use sort of a hands, we use our hands when we speak. There can be some cultural things behind that. There's the ways of understanding the way people communicate aren't just the actual words, as well as the enormous complexity of actually, translating a word. It's not straightforward. So what's their process, and do you get to know them very well?
It's interesting, Daniel. I haven't really thought about that the word myself now that you pointed it out. But in practice, interpreters do speaking and translators do writing. So that's how it works in practice. I don't know why it works that way, but when we speak of translators, they translate documents, and
Right.
interpreters interpret or translate speech.
Okay, that's interesting.
And yes, we do build up close relationships with interpreters. So I get to know interpreters on a personal basis, or we use particular agencies that we build up relationships with. And it's important for me that the same interpreter is available throughout all of my meetings with the child, because they're, again, like you said, a point of reference either from their own country or from their own culture. And I'd be quite specific in the type of interpreter I'm requesting. So, for example, if I'm working with a child who's from Darfur in Sudan, I will particularly request a an Arabic speaker who's from the Darfur region, because their dialect might be slightly different. So I've got to be sensitive to slight nuances in language. So sometimes, for example, the Home Office at that initial interview, number 3 in our diagram, would have a generic Arabic interpreter, and they might not understand what the child's saying and record some facts incorrectly. Um, and that's why we've got to be very careful with the tiniest detail with language, because words within dialects, even within Arabic particularly, can be quite significantly different. So yeah, it's very important.
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted. You were talking us through the process. We were at sort of 9, I think, at that point,
Yes.
actually. Yeah.
So once the interview is done, I get a transcript of the interview. And at that point, that is when I send what we call our legal representations to the Home Office. So I will listen to or read through the transcript. And if there are any discrepancies between the witness statement that we sent to them and the interview, there is an opportunity for us to address them. So I will speak to the client again and say, okay, you said this at your interview. What exactly did you mean by this? Can you elaborate further? Can we explain this to them? Because it's very important that their account is coherent throughout. And there can be lapses in their memory, or they can remember a new fact at the interview which they didn't remember before. So it's important that we put all of that on record. And then that is when I will quote specific information at this stage about their country. So country of origin reports that has been compiled, that have been compiled by country specific academics. So there are lots of sources of these research. There's something called the EIN, the Electronic Immigration Network, which is a place where all of this research is collated for immigration professionals. So I can go and look up, for example, persecution of people from Darfur in Sudan, and find up-to-date evidence, news items, research articles, and I will collate all of that information. And then I will also look at case law. So what are the recent cases in the upper tribunal that have been designated country guidance cases?
Right.
So
Okay, so the upper tribunal, it seems like there's two types of evidence here. There's evidence about the actual country, where or the region, it might not just be a country, where someone's actually coming from, which is sort of academic evidence, NGO evidence, all of that evidence, and then there's the evidence about the individual child. There seem to be two different bodies of evidence. You've got to bring them all together. That's really interesting.
So
Yeah.
we call that individual evidence and objective evidence. Objective evidence being the evidence about the country
Right.
and that particular issue facing the child. So we can again break down the asylum definition and talk about that. But asylum is claimed for one of 5 reasons. You've got to be facing persecution on the basis of your nationality, your race, your religion, your membership of a particular social group, or expression of a political opinion. And it's only for those 5 reasons that you can be granted asylum. So my responsibility in my representations is to show which of those boxes they tick in
Right.
essence. And how does that all add up in the larger context of the geopolitical situation in that country, but also how have those cases been treated in the upper tribunal?
Right. Right. So obviously there may be, because there may be cases all about a country, and the upper tribunal will resolve an issue sometimes about a country. Right. I wonder if you just want to talk us through just the end of this picture before we move up to onto the statement that you sent us to have a look at.
Yes. So the Home Office then make a decision on the asylum claim. Sadly, at the moment, we're seeing massive delays in decision making. We've seen in the news towards the end of last year, the Prime Minister made a pledge to process and deal with the backlog of asylum claims. And there was a claim made that that was actually done. But in practice, we've got loads of clients still waiting for asylum claims to be processed. So I've got clients waiting for up to 3 years after their interview to have a decision made.
And during that period, they are the local authority's responsibility in terms of housing
Yes.
and care, which might be
But they're not able to work if they turn
No.
18, for example, or not able to necessarily go to university. So they're stuck essentially until their decision comes. But once they get the decision, they're either granted refugee status or refused refugee status. If they're given refugee status in the UK, they're allowed to remain in the country for 5 years. And after 5 years, they can apply for what we call indefinite leave to remain. So permanent residency in the country. They can apply to stay permanently. If they're refused and they're under the age of 17 and a half, as I mentioned earlier, they're given temporary permission to stay. But in any case, a refusal always carries with it, except in very specific cases, the right of appeal. There are some cases which are certified as inadmissible. So, for example, some of the cases from Albania where the Home Office have taken a particular stance, they say, no, this case is inadmissible according to particular legal provisions, and there's no right of appeal. So then we challenge that through judicial review. But in most cases, there's a right of appeal, and then it goes to the tribunal. So the first-tier tribunal, and we've got to collect evidence to substantiate the appeal. So a further statement from the client, more objective evidence, but in this case, we actually pay an expert from that country to write a report on this particular client's case. And we say, okay, here's a person who's fleeing a blood feud in Albania. What are the facts in this case, and what sort of treatment would this young person face if he were returned to his country? And there'd be a 100-page report prepared by an expert on this particular child's case. And then all of that country information that I mentioned before, we put all of that in a bundle, submit it to the tribunal, and then the tribunal send that to the Home Office. They have a chance to respond. in terms of a respondent's review. And then there's a date set for a hearing. Always, as I mentioned earlier, we instruct barristers to represent our client. So I will contact a set of chambers and pick a barrister whom I believe would do a good job in this particular case. And then the hearing itself is in one of the tribunals, either in London or Birmingham, and then the appeal is allowed or refused. The process can carry on if the appeal is refused, with further rights of appeal to the upper tribunal or the Court of Appeal.
And if it goes up to that level, it's got to have leave, and they've got to have particular reasons what you can appeal. You can't just appeal because you don't like the result. You've got to have particular reasons. What proportion of your cases go to an initial appeal?
So I was just looking at the statistics today, and the Home Office's own statistics are that 75% of asylum claims processed in 2023 were granted. So contrary to what we hear in the news about illegal immigrants, and we can talk about that label being a misnomer, being not legitimate refugees, the Home Office themselves recognize 75% of people claiming asylum in this country as genuine refugees.
That's 70%, and that's even on the basis that actually, the Home Office is pretty strict, really strict, and I'm sure a lot aren't. In terms of your own sort of caseload, how many sort of are in that 70%?
I would say that the grant rate I'm seeing is slightly skewed at the moment because of those two countries I mentioned, Albania and Iran. So if I have Albanian or Iranian children whom I'm dealing with, I know for sure that at the moment their asylum claims are going to be refused. So I've got to brace myself for that and work from the very outset under the assumption that this is going to proceed to an appeal.
Right. Okay. At that point, I think I'd like to turn to look at your statement. So, Kayla, I can share that actually. So, Kayla, could you close that document down? Great. Now I'm going to go to the share. That's brilliant. I will share it on my screen because I've got that up here. So you very kindly shared with us a model. Well, you can tell us what this actually is, this asylum document.
So this is a statement that I've compiled for this particular meeting today. This doesn't refer to any one individual, but it brings together facts from a number of different Sudanese asylum claims I'm dealing with at the moment. So this could be considered a model or a typical asylum claim from a Sudanese young person. And we can talk about the different aspects of it, but this is what I would actually submit to the Home Office, having worked through all of this with a client.
Right. Okay. We don't have I'm going to we can spend about 5 or so minutes talking through this, not to read it collectively, because I think everyone's been shared it, but almost looking at the actual categories that you use. So, you have the date at the beginning, and then the early life, which seemed, I've read this already. So obviously you have some background there about where they're from. And these are all the things that you ask them. These are all the things that you try and garnish from them when you're just trying to give about the context of their lives. What struck me, I was talking about, almost day-to-day things of life. The father was a farmer with animals, farming land, cows and goats. It gives a real window onto sort of the day-to-day experiences of people. And then in the second section, you move on to talk about attacks by one group on another group, some inter-ethnic racial violence that takes place. And I can see from what you just said about the categories within the legitimate categories for being considered an asylum seeker. You talked us through that list just a while ago. You've got to kind of draft this statement, I imagine, in a way with that in mind, because you're already thinking this statement's got to tick the box of one of those categories. So it's what we talk about in law. This is a very general legal practice technique. You talk, you've got somebody telling their story, and then you're the lawyer. And you've got to, the law, and you've got to package their story in a way that almost translating it into law, because it's then got to relate to the legal categories, or what the goalposts are in law, and you've got to link what someone's talking to that. And that's what lawyers do in every area. I mean, immigration asylum is one area, but it's what family lawyers do, it's what property lawyers do, it's what contract lawyers do. When people sit there in front of you telling their stories, you have to kind of translate it into law somehow, with those relevant facts. And what you describe here is these, quite terrifying stories of attacks, and obviously it fits that category of this asylum claim is based, I imagine, on being a victim because of the racial group they're a member of.
So
Would that be right? Or
yes, in some ways. So there are a number of different categories. I'm not just trying to fit the asylum definition. There are other things I know that the Home Office are going to look at. So if we go back to the first page of the statement, the whole first section is because of the questions I know they're going to be asked at the interview.
Right.
So I know they're going to be probed to verify their nationality. So they're going to be asked very, very detailed, specific questions about their area of origin, their local area. Ridiculous questions sometimes that are general knowledge questions about a country, like what were some TV channels you watched? Can you name 2 pop stars from your culture? And some of these kids, they don't have TVs, right?
No, and I wondered as well, because point 5 here says tribes in the areas include the Masalit, Bargo, Tama, and Daju. And I went in the interview, will they sort of say, can you tell us the names of the tribes in your area?
Yeah.
And they expected to know the names of all the different tribes,
Exactly.
right?
And so they would say, I had one Iranian client who was asked, there's a roundabout near your area. What was the image displayed on that particular roundabout outside your road? So, or there are 2 mountains I can see near your area. What were the names of those mountains? So they're basically trying to, and this goes to a broader issue of in law, we have this concept of you're innocent until proven guilty, right? And sadly, with asylum claims, the way the Home Office treat these children, particularly in interviews, is as if they've committed an offense and as if they're not a genuine asylum seeker. That is the starting point that's adopted in most of these cases. So rather than this is a genuine questioning process of what's your situation, what has happened to you, why do you fit these definitions, it's not that. Rather than being that, it is, okay, why are you not from your particular country? Why are you lying to us about this?
It sounds like an interrogation. It sounds like, with the right. And that's even though you've said that when someone is designated an unaccompanied minor, the onus is actually on the Home Office. So actually, it's almost, that's not in practice what's taking place. Yeah.
No, we don't see that happening in practice. And I mean, again, I don't want to massively generalize. There are exceptions always. There are Home Office caseworkers who are sensitive. I don't want to paint an entirely negative picture of them. There are caseworkers who do a really good job. But my personal experience has been that most of them are not really versed in dealing with these children. So the second section of the statement is very particular facts and details about the persecution they faced. So that comes to the definition you mentioned, Daniel. So what part of the definition do they fit? In this case, this person has faced issues on the grounds of their race, but the racial issue also feeds into a broader geopolitical conflict within Sudan itself, a local civil war essentially that's happening at the moment. So and there's a region in Sudan called Darfur where this sort of persecution is more prevalent, and we're seeing this. So it will take the political opinion box as well, in addition to the race box, and anyone who arrives in the UK who is a child ticks the category of particular social group as well, because children, broadly speaking, in case law, have been recognized as a particular social group.
Right.
So it's not just the race definition that they fit the political opinion definition and the particular social group definition as well.
And the childhood status. Yeah. I'm just conscious of time and I want to make sure everyone else has a chance to ask questions. So that's that section which describes the attack. And, everyone on this call has been sent this, so they can read it as well, which I'm going rather quick. So that describes the horrendous examples and stories of appalling things happening. And then the next section, of course, is the journey, which is fascinating. It's actually how they got to the country. And here you talk about the child going to Libya, to Chad, back to Libya, and then to Tunisia, the Italian island of Lampedusa. And one can't imagine what these kind of journeys are actually like. And of course, I imagine for a young person to be able to know the names of all the countries and the ports and harbors that they've actually been in, that's quite an assumption in itself, I imagine.
This is quite an atypical statement in that a lot of young people won't remember all of these names and all of these places. But also, if you scroll up slightly, I think it was the previous page. Point number 34, it's tiny, but there's quite a lot there. He was made to work in a garage as a mechanic, and he wasn't paid for this work. They only gave him food. Now, this sends alarm bells ringing in my head and says this young person is a potential victim of trafficking.
Right.
So that's the reason I've emphasized that, and I will make a separate referral for this person to be assessed as a potential victim of trafficking. So the journey, often that part has references to whether they were trafficked from their country to the UK.
Right. Right. I mean, that's fascinating because it goes back to what lawyers have to do quite a lot of. There are these legal concepts, trafficking, minor, unaccompanied, all these different categories that exist, and all the categories you ruled out you gave us in terms of the boxes that entitle it. And real life then has to mold it into them. And I suppose there are boundaries to what is and what isn't trafficking. And how wide is it? How narrow is it? What technically in law counts as trafficking? And that's really complicated. And that's what lawyers do a lot of, is sort of sometimes trying to tease the boundaries a bit wider, trying to have it defined in a slightly wider way, and the Home Office trying to define it in a narrower way. And I guess that's what happens in law with concepts. And then the last paragraph 39 is I eventually found a lorry hid in the back and entered the UK, which is and then that brings those images that I think are perhaps more familiar to people listening to the news and hearing the things, and then being in the UK. Does it matter what country the last country that they came from? So here they came from France. How does that impact on your role and the law?
So the Home Office always jump on this as being a ground to refuse asylum. Legally, there's no law saying that the young person has an obligation to claim asylum in the first safe country they enter. When the UK was a member of the EU, there was an agreement called the Dubs Agreement, where if they passed to a safe European country, there was the ability for the UK government to return them to that country. That is not relevant anymore because we've exited the EU. So they can't be returned to France or Italy, for example. But I have to say if you look at point 38 or point 37, I have to explain why they didn't claim asylum in those countries. So in Italy, for example, because he had been in the system and didn't receive any papers for a long time, that he decided to move on. And point 38, in France, he was homeless and he didn't have any care. That's why he had to leave France. So for those particular European countries that they passed through, I have to say why they left and why they didn't claim asylum. But inevitably, that's going to be addressed in their asylum decision, and looked upon unfavorably that they pass through those countries, but all of them do.
Yeah, they're all up against it. Yeah. And then this section talks about the final section talks about life in the UK. I mean, is this the average length of the statement?
I think so, yes. Broadly speaking, it could be longer, it could be shorter, but I'd spend I'd give the most amount of detail to describing the persecution they faced, because that is the thing that's going to be picked apart in great detail in the interview. So in theory, the more I give in the statement, the less they should be asked at the interview. It doesn't always happen that way in practice. But I try and make it as detailed as possible so that further down the line, if they're refused asylum at appeal, I can say in my representations to a judge, look, we put all of this in a statement,
Yes.
but they were asked all of these questions again at interview. That's not valid or right.
No, absolutely. I mean, that really, again, mirrors what one expects to see or is more familiar seeing in a criminal law context. I'm going to close that document now. Thank you for that. I'm sure people will find it very interesting and very moving. I'm going to open it up for questions now. There is one question I've seen coming up in the chat, which is, at what point are people get access to psychologists? I mean, clearly, I imagine all of these children are traumatized, deeply traumatized, whether or not that's defined as PTSD or not. At what point is that assistance and expertise psychologists made available to them?
Again, it's a sad state of affairs. We spoke about access to justice and a lack of legal aid providers. There's a massive lack of psychologists and psychiatrists. I mean, in Oxford, I've got most of my clients on a waiting list, and they're waiting for years sometimes to see a psychologist. So sadly, the only first responders they have access to are their social workers. But until they've just got to wait for a very, very long time until they're able to access professional counseling in a local authority context.
I mean, I wonder, I mean, this is again echo something I know from, working in the domestic abuse field, that sometimes the evidence of trauma is can be evidence of torture. So, to what extent do you, in inverted commas, not use, but, provide evidence of the extent of trauma as evidence of what they've been treated, which I mean, I almost feel uncomfortable saying that, but I'm sure you know what I mean.
I totally get that. So that's usually at the appeal stage. So if the asylum claim has been refused, and I believe that this child shows clear signs of mental health issue or something like PTSD, I will then pay a psychiatrist to carry out a psychiatric assessment on this young person, and their report will go into the court bundle along with the country expert's report. And the psychiatrist will particularly say what impact return of this young person to their country would have on their mental health. That will be taken into account by a judge.
Right. And just a final couple of questions from me before I throw it open. I just want to broaden it out. What are the best things in your job, and what are the things you really don't like about it?
The best thing is saying to a young person and giving them the news that they've been actually granted asylum. The responses are very interesting. I've had everything from just stone-faced denial because they've just been through so much, and they're desensitized to all of it. Even something as joyful as them being granted asylum doesn't mean anything to them because of all they've been through, ranging from that all the way to two clients of mine whom I gave the news to literally dancing all the way out of my office in joy. That's an image I'll have forever in my head. And that's the best part of this job. The worst part about it is having to hear about all of these horrific stories and actually be there for the child emotionally while, like you mentioned, having to fit all of these issues in a particular legal framework. That is something I struggled with. And also as a human being, I've got to try and manage these emotions myself. And maintain a healthy balance in terms of how much I invest myself emotionally in these issues. Because if I take all of these things I deal with on a day-to-day basis at work back home with me, that's going to really impact my mental health, and I'm going to struggle. And
Yeah.
to be completely frank and open, that's something I did struggle with at the very beginning when I started working as a caseworker.
Yes.
And
I mean, I've spoken to lots of lawyers I know who work in the child protection field, and they say, you know, similar things. If your day-to-day job is child protection, you just have to have some way of emotionally coping with these things. It must be really difficult. Yeah.
For me, that happens to be music, so that's
Yeah. Now I was going to say, so that was my final quick question before I opened the was about music. You're a musician, you're a conductor. This is a huge important part of your life. And I noticed as well that you talk about, you know, the orchestra you're involved with, you know, is there for sort of migrants and actually draws attention to. Is there something about acting for somebody, as well as, you know, even the words acting for somebody, if you're being an advocate for somebody, and then performing and then playing and celebrating with, you know, with voice and sound and stuff? They're not totally separate, it strikes me, in some ways. There's enormous dignity in both. There's most pride in both. There's joy, there's a great humanity in both, really.
Yes, I think once a musician, you're always a musician and an artist in many ways. And all of this in many ways is an art. The way you tell a person's story, even in a legal context,
Yeah.
definitely art in many ways.
No, it's one of the things we talk about a lot when we're with students is the narrative law, the storytelling nature of law. Absolutely. Which made me wonder, why do you feel barristers can do it and you can't? I think you'd be an amazing advocate in court. I wasn't convinced by that, Josh.
You're very kind, but in practice, even though some of us might think we might be able to do it, these are people who have had very specific skills in terms of catering to, say, tribunal rules or protocols with judges, and they've got years and years of experience before them of dealing with judges and being experienced in handling issues that arise during a hearing, for example. It's not to say that we can't do that, but the policy, at least, that we have adopted is that it's best left to the experts.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Great. Okay. Has anybody else got any questions there? Who would like to ask some questions? Any at all? Raphael, hi. Do you want to come on and ask your question? Raphael, your hand's up.
Hi. Nice to meet you. Thank you for a great talk. I just wanted to ask you, Josh, what are your thoughts on the Rwanda asylum plan? Whether it will solve problems that we have, how justifiable do you think it is, and how much do you think the courts could get involved into the future?
Yeah, great question, Raphael. That's definitely in the news. Josh.
There's already quite a lot of litigation that has happened in this, and the recent verdict from the Supreme Court. And what we're in essence seeing is the government trying to rewrite law to override the decision of the Supreme Court with this new Safety of Rwanda bill that's going through Parliament at the moment. We have seen in practice some of our clients threatened with removal to Rwanda, not with children, but with adult clients. It remains to be seen whether a single flight to Rwanda will actually take off, because there's going to be litigation inevitably in the form of judicial review and various other aspects. What I think in some ways is irrelevant in terms of how it'll affect our clients, but whether, practically speaking, if you look at the past, precedent has been that deterrence policies haven't really worked in this country, and this is supposed to be a deterrence policy to deter people from coming to this country. And there is very, very, very little evidence, none at all, pretty much, to show that this policy is going to work. And there have been people within the Home Office who have said that, civil servants who have said that, government ministers who have said that. but there's party politics at play here, which is a big part of immigration law. And immigration law is one of the areas that's extremely politicized, and it's working hand in hand with what goes on in Parliament. So as a lawyer, it's very important that I follow what's happening in Parliament, the debates going on, because that will have a very real impact on the work I'm doing.
Yeah, it's a highly politicized area, the work you do. And indeed, often in those debates, the role of people like you, immigration lawyers often aren't treated very kindly in those debates, or there's a perception of them, which is pretty unfortunate. I see there's a couple of questions from the chat. Harkiran's asking, would the child be given any legal help if the abuse or their treatment wasn't based on or due to one of the categories reasons mentioned before?
Yes. So, for example, the child might come from a region where there's general widespread conflict. Afghanistan, for example. So I've got lots of Afghan young people who don't have a particular box they tick in terms of these 5 categories. They are granted something called humanitarian protection. So if their country is in a war zone, the government might decide a particular policy of granting humanitarian protection to all asylum seekers from those countries who didn't arrive through one of the resettlement routes. And I must say, if you hear this phrase "safe and legal routes to migration" in the news quite a lot, the fact is that they don't really exist. In the Home Affairs Select Committee last year, when the Home Secretary was asked what route exists for a young person from Syria to come to the UK, she couldn't really answer the question, and that was very revealing, because the fact is that there's no safe way for anyone to claim asylum in the UK at the moment, except for arriving through so-called illegal means. So yeah, that's another issue that's at play here.
And a very technical question, one quickly from Becky, who's saying, once you give the tribunal the documents of the client's details, do they have a specific time frame to respond?
So there's...
If you could answer that one quite quickly. I know it's a technical procedural question, that one.
There's a deadline of 14 days from the Home Office refusal for us to lodge a tribunal appeal in the tribunal. But then it's the timeline that's set by the particular tribunal that determines how long this takes. So the tribunal typically give us 8 weeks to get all this evidence together. In practice, we always request extensions.
Okay, and there's a question from Danny, I see, which in the chat, which is about the political context and debates about this, which we've kind of touched on, or don't have time to go into too much detail. And there's a question here saying, could you share where the Odyssey ensemble fits alongside your job role?
Yeah, so I'm just going to post a link to
please do. I was hoping
Odyssey in the chat. So do check it out. It's an orchestra that I run, which uses orchestral music, to advocate for the human dignity of refugees. So we're steering clear of politics, but we're saying these are people, these are human beings, and they should be treated as human beings, and their stories should be heard. That's why we exist.
That's wonderful. Thanks for that. And a quick question from Rachel Pascoe, and then I've got one final question. So Rachel, hi.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful talk today. I was just wondering, what do you think the biggest problem with the immigration system is from a legal perspective?
It's quite a tricky one to answer. I think one of the issues we're seeing at the moment is inefficiency in terms of the process. So how these asylum claims are processed, the time that's taken to process them. There's a lot of time that could be saved at various stages by streamlining these processes. That's one of the biggest issues in dealing with the number of asylum claims at the moment.
Thank you. And the final question I'm going to ask is, this is the question we always ask our guests on the legal practice conversation at Birkbeck. It's all sort of, the desert islands discs question, which is, you're a legislator, you can introduce any law you wish. You have absolute legislative power. I'm giving you the power to make a new law or repeal something. What new law would you like to put on the books?
I would establish safe and legal routes for people to come to this country. That's something I mentioned before. It's something that doesn't exist, that's claimed to exist, I'd actually make it exist so that people don't have to make dangerous journeys on boats to arrive in this country. And they can do so through safe routes, claim asylum in a country near them and be brought to the UK, or through some other safe legal route, rather than having to make these journeys, which everyone agrees isn't in the best interests of anyone.
Yeah, it's really chilling and yeah, it's extremely chilling and sobering hearing you talk about this and having read that asylum statement as well. I'd like to give you a very warm thanks from all of us here at Birkbeck. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. That's been really fascinating. You've described what you do, your emotional input in that work, some technical bits of law, some general things about what law actually involves, from storytelling to actually really having that detailed knowledge of statutes and frameworks and procedures which we work in. And that really is the real part of law. So thank you very much for joining us. That's great. I really appreciate it. It's been fascinating hearing you. Thank you so much, Josh.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us all this evening. If anyone's got any questions about studying law at Birkbeck, please don't hesitate to send an email to me. I'm going to put my email in the chat. I know one question in the chat was about LLBs and LLMs. So do please, don't hesitate to emailing me about that. I'll make sure you get all the information you need about studying at Birkbeck. So please join us then. That's great. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay, good night, everybody. Have a good, safe weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.